Now, to miss one target on climate change might be considered a misfortune. To miss two looks like carelessness. And now to miss a third annual target for reducing carbon emissions is definitely a problem. So what do the government do? Well, they blame the way the data is collected and then promise a bit more money, as Andrew Kerr reports.
A less than chaotic climate in Edinburgh today, but the Scottish Government prides itself on big aspirations on climate change. In fact, in 2009 they passed the Climate Change Act, billed as a world leader. That act set an overall target of a 42% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions between 1990 and 2020. The figures announced today are for 2012. Between 2011 and 2012, emissions rose by 0.5%, and the total was above the target the government set itself. That means the government has missed its targets every year since the act came into force. They argue technical, statistical issues make the targets harder to achieve than when they were set, and insist they are on track.
We are confident the underlying trajectory for 2020 is still on track. As I've acknowledged all along, we may have challenges from year to year, but we are taking the decisive action today to try and step up our efforts.
That will mean more sustainable transport like cycling. There's £15 million promised for that. And a new Cabinet subcommittee on climate change to track progress. But is that enough?
You really need a comprehensive package if we're serious about delivering on the targets. They are challenging targets, but the government continually go around the world talking about Scotland's world-leading targets. We look to other countries to aspire to Scotland's targets. You need to put your money where your mouth is and start delivering on those targets if that is to be credible.
The 50-odd million tonnes a year that we're putting into the atmosphere need to start coming down by 1 million a year or thereabouts. Over the next few years, and that's not going to happen unless the Scottish Government recognises that current policies are not going to achieve it. We need to go much further on cutting people's fuel bills, cutting transport congestion, and a whole host of other areas where climate change policy can be good for people, good for the economy, and good for the planet.
And those campaigning say that, odd as it may sound, having to tackle climate change may actually be good for us all in other ways too.
What we need to do is talk about the benefits of climate change. So we need to think about reducing fuel poverty, which is a big problem in Scotland, about delivering warmer homes for people, about tackling air pollution, which is associated with something in the region of 2,000 deaths a year in Scotland. So this is about reducing fuel bills, reducing the burden on the NHS, and delivering a greener future for the Scottish people.
For that green future to seem possible, the Scottish Government could actually do with a year where they hit these challenging targets.
Well, joining me in the studio is the Environment Minister, Paul Wheelhouse. This is a bit of a disaster. It's not just that you didn't cut carbon emissions by enough, they actually went up in the last year.
It's true, emissions in Scotland rose by 0.5%, but we have to see it in the context that the UK had a 2.9% increase in emissions, and of course our economy is quite closely linked to that.
The UK government didn't trumpet that they had the most ambitious targets in the world. They didn't claim they were going to be world leaders in reducing carbon emissions. That's what the Scottish government did. And 3 years in a row you've missed the target.
Well, there's a good reason why the UK government hasn't trumpeted its ambition in that sense, because their targets are not as ambitious as the Scottish government's targets.
There's no point in having ambitious targets if you can't meet them.
No, indeed. Scotland has taken a unanimous act in terms of having very ambitious climate change targets. We always knew they were going to be stretching. We always knew they'd be difficult to achieve. But what we have done is put in place a plan which can get us there for 2020 and beyond. So I'm confident we're on track to achieve our 42% target by 2020.
How can we possibly be on track? We've missed the targets every year for 3 years in a row, and they were the targets that were easier to hit. To get to your target of 42% cut in emissions by 2020, you've actually got to hit some much more ambitious, much more drastic targets, and you haven't been able to do it with the easy ones.
Well, if you look at it from the point of view of the advice we get from independent advisors, the Committee on Climate Change, they're not directly employed by the Scottish Government, but they concluded that we are on track to achieve our targets. There are problems at a sectoral level in residential emissions and in transport, and those are the areas that we've tackled today with the announcements we've made.
You're going to need some pretty drastic policy changes, aren't you, if you're going to hit these targets? So what's going to completely radically change that means that we'll get back on track with carbon emissions?
Well, it's a mixture of long-term investments like forestry, for example. That takes 8 to 10 years for trees to have their maximum carbon sequestration potential. Investment in peatlands, which we've already announced in previous budgets. But what we're announcing today are additional measures in terms of energy efficiency and in terms of district heating. Those are two ways in which we can make quite a quick impact in terms of tackling emissions.
You've got other initiatives. You're giving some more money to encourage people to cycle more today, for instance. But even that feels like a drop in the ocean. You've got a target of 10% of journeys in Scotland made on a bike by 2020. It's 1.3% across the country, I think, at the moment. You're offering them, what, £10 million, when cycling campaigners say it would take £100 million a year for you to ever hit your cycling target.
Well, Keith Brown, my colleague, has announced £15 million of funding today. 10 million, which is about infrastructure, 5 million
$5 million
choice.
after the next election, I think, isn't it?
No, it's 5 million Smarter Choice, Smarter Places funding in the year ahead, which will target behavioural change, trying to get people out of fossil fuel types of transport into more sustainable and active travel.
50 million doesn't sound like a lot when cycling campaigners like Pedal to Parliament say it's going to take 100 million.
Well, this is additional money on top of the investment we've already announced through Keith Brown. He has put in place money which can be doubled up by local authorities, so it's match funded. The 7 million of the 10 million he announced today for sustainable travel can be match funded by local authorities to take it up to 14 million. So we are trying to be as helpful as we can to local authorities that have aspirations to invest in sustainable and active travel, and this is one way we can do it.
Let's look at some of your government's other policies. You've been arguing for a long time to abolish air passenger duty at Scottish airports to make them more competitive against other ones in the UK. To increase the amount of air travel coming into Scotland is just going to put our carbon emissions up, isn't it? Not help you meet your targets to cut them.
Well, we've taken a very responsible position. Unlike most other governments, we include international aviation and shipping in our climate change targets. So if through a result of a policy change like APD, which we don't think will have a huge impact on emissions, we raise transport emissions, then we would have the ability to take that out in the rest of the economy. We would have a responsibility to tackle that. So we are being responsible with that. If aviation emissions do rise, the rest of the economy absorbs the additional emissions that are being produced.
Okay. Paul Wheelhouse, thanks for coming in to talk to us today.